Okay, so season 22 comes out and we get 3 new strand aspects. Last season, we got 3 new strand aspects, one for each specific class. Same thing's happening again this season. So in today's video, I want to take a look at Banner of War, which was the Titan class's newest aspect, which I think fundamentally alters how Titans can approach the Strand Berserker class, as well as the build crafting for that class. We'll start by going over Banner of War, how it fits in with different exotics with some gameplay to demonstrate the strengths or weaknesses of each of those, and then we'll end up on full builds for each of those exotics, as well as any other weapons that can boost the effects and playstyle for the builds. Part 1. Banner of War Breakdown. Banner of War provides 2 fragment slots, and reads, defeat a target with a melee attack, finisher, or sword to raise a Banner of War that pulses with energy, periodically healing nearby allies and increasing melee and sword damage. Targets defeated by you and nearby allies charge the banner, increasing the speed of those healing pulses. So here's just a quick slide of information that I have that shows the damage and duration stacks, as well as the healing stacks of the pulses. You can see that's a 40% melee damage increase, plus 25% glaive melee damage, and plus 10% sword damage. So as soon as you get Banner of War active, you're getting all those benefits right away just at one stack. See the initial time being 15 seconds, and allies near you within 10 meters are going to be buffed and get that buff. Then you can see the times 1 through 4 stacks, how you need to get to those stacks, how many kills, and how many seconds you'll gain when you're getting those kills. Next, you're going to look at the healing. What the healing pulse provides is 20 HP every 2.5 seconds. The max duration of this buff is 30 seconds, and the healing pulse is double the size of the damage benefit bonus. So then you can see times 1, it's going to be a 2.5 second pulse. At times 2, 2 seconds, times 3, 1.5, and times 4, 1 second pulse. Now let's head over to the game and take a look at this in action. So here we are over in the Lost Sector. These are just regular ads, regular red bars. We get our first melee kill and we get Banner of War. You see it starts at that 15-second duration. You can see the ring around you that has the healing pulse. And then we're going to get some additional kills, because once we get that first melee kill, all we need to do is just get some additional kills to keep this buff going. Now we're at the times 2. We're getting a slightly faster pulse for the healing than when we hit times 3. And I'm spacing these kills out just to show you that it doesn't have to be very rapid kills. You're still able to stack this buff up. And at times 4, see how fast that it's healing, that it's out healing all the damage of these red bars. Now this is really great in low tier content, and you could probably keep this up indefinitely, especially because your allies that are near you will be able to extend the buff for you as well. So then there's the melee bonus of that 40% damage. Now the times 4 is just for the healing, but you're going to get that melee damage bonus as soon as you're at that times 1. And that's where this aspect really starts to kick in. And that's where we can start segueing into our second section, exotic armor. Exotic number 1, Synthoceps, buffs melee range, being surrounded buffs melee damage. So these are going to pair nicely with Banner of War, because Banner of War is able to give us a ridiculous amount of melee increase, which is 40%. That's already a good increase, but then we take this up with Synthoceps and we take it up another 200%. And these stack multiplicatively, so this isn't just adding these buffs together. That's going to be 280%, just being surrounded with Banner of War active while wearing Synthoceps, so 280% more damage. And that's before you apply either a 15% weaken or a 30% weaken, which will take those damage numbers that you're dealing even further. So I'm going to assume that if you're a more experienced player, you know about the Delta power cap. I went into this Lost Sector at 1817, so I'm basically 23 power under here in this Master Lost Sector. And even though I'm 23 power under here, which is very close to Grandmasters, I still am able to one-shot champions with just a melee ability. That's what's so ridiculous and great about this, is that I'm getting healing on demand, which is part of that Banner of War. All of the exotics that I show are going to be able to have that though. But the thing that they're not all going to be able to do is delete a champion with just a melee ability. That's what makes Synthoceps strong. That's the strength of that build. Now the downfall is also having to be surrounded. It's not always possible to be surrounded in Grandmaster content, because there are things that are just going to one-shot you. Too many enemies get around you when you are surrounded, and then you're not going to have enough healing from the pulses, or maybe your Banner of War drops off early and you're not able to get those healing pulses. You're not able to get Woven Mail up and have that damage resistance from Woven Mail on top of the Banner of War healing. And then you're in a situation where you're in a bad spot and you're probably going to die. But this is also with a Strand Surge on the Lost sector. So if you don't have a Strand Surge, that's most likely not going to happen unless you have a powerful enough weaken, which would need to be the 30% weaken, or maybe even the 15. I'm not sure which one would need to be there. And on some of them, I don't have the weaken effect up and I'm still able to hit them and one-shot them. I think it may depend on how many pellets of the Fleshit land on the enemy. But nonetheless, it just goes to show you that this is the strength of the build, but the downfall is that being surrounded and requiring the Strand Surge at all times to get the most out of this build. Now, would it be very effective on day one dungeons and things of that nature? Absolutely. It absolutely can do very well in dungeons where there's not typically champions, and in normal raids, it would be ridiculously good. Another thing that I didn't mention before I segue into the next build exotic would be the fact that it's also going to buff the glaive damage with Synthoceps, and it's also going to buff your super damage when you're surrounded. So it has multiple benefits to it. It's not just being surrounded is going to buff the Fleshit Storm. It's also that being surrounded can buff melee damage with the glaive if you want to build into something like Vexcalibur or just a regular glaive with Swashbuckler, which is also going to be something multiplicatively that's going to add to the damage. But you'll also have that super that's going to have a bonus 50% damage increase as well, which is going to be very helpful for getting the most out of that super. Now, another thing that I don't want to specifically say is good for Synthoceps, because it's good in almost all of these builds where we're stacking melee damage through Banner of War. But the one that it matters the most out of any of these builds would be 1-2 punch shotguns. With the 1-2 punch shotgun, that is another aspect to this build that's very potent and very powerful in literally one-shots. And while I say I'm one-shotting with Fleshit Storms, I am, but I'm casting full valleys. With some of the other builds that use Tractor Cannon and 1-2 punch, you can absolutely delete them with just a typical melee. Potency and the power of it becomes amplified to a whole nother degree at that point. So then you're able to make that build about that. Now, the downfall of that, in my opinion, is that it can be a little bit complicated in challenging content like Grandmasters, Master Raids, and Contest Raids. So that requires a lot of setup to get active and can fall off quickly if one of the moving pieces doesn't align properly and something goes wrong. That's going to conclude my thoughts on the Synthoceps build. I do think they're absolutely powerful, though. Give those a try, and we'll look back at this build in just a little bit. Exotic number 2, Heart of Inmost Light. Now, with Heart of Inmost Light, you'll use one ability to briefly empower the other two abilities. The biggest strength, in my opinion, is the neutral game and all-around ability uptime. Smaller damage bonuses, but you do have safer access to them. So that is one of the biggest strengths, that neutral game. The neutral game that Heart of Inmost Light has is really good because you don't have to put yourself in a dangerous situation and be surrounded just to get a bonus to your melee damage. But before we go any further, what I want to do is break down what Heart of Inmost Light actually does. So we're going to use an ability to power our other two abilities. Empowered melee times 1 and times 2 on the screen, you can see the bonus damage increase of those. And then you have the base regeneration rate, which is just going to skyrocket when they're empowered. The same thing's going to happen with grenade times 1 and times 2. So because these always are going to have that increased base regeneration rate, you're going to be able to cycle them quite frequently. And you pretty much almost always have an ability ready to go in your pocket. So we can use our barricade and then empower our melee times 1, throw a grenade, and then have empowered melee times 2. So what this leads into is ability uptime. We have more orbs because of the high ability uptime. With more abilities, that means more orbs. With more orbs, that means more ability energy and more woven mail uptime. Now, another thing that makes this really great is the flexibility for those abilities. You could run a shackle grenade with continuity. That's still a viable option, and it's faster ability regen than Synthoceps builds. And it's also viable with Fleshit Storm or using Into the Fray for easier woven mail access and melee regeneration rates. You have so much flexibility, you're not locked into the shackle grenade or Fleshit Storm with Hoyle. Now, in my personal opinion, a strength of Hoyle is its Tangle Generation. I believe that it has better synergy with Thread of Fury, where dealing damage with the Tangle generates melee energy. The Tangle Generation is the strength here, because as more abilities return, you have more Tangle Generation. More Tangle Generation means that you have more ways to make Thread of Fury proc. But a weakness would be that you cannot burst down mini bosses or champions. You can still put some good DPS onto them though, but you won't be deleting them like you could with the Synthoceps build. Now, just because you can't do that doesn't mean that you still aren't being able to take advantage of what Banner of War provides. You're still going to be able to get a 25% glaive melee damage bonus, and you're still going to get multiplicative melee damage increases from Banner of War on top of Heart of Inmost Light, and you can still Tractor Cannon and 1-2 punch with this build, just like you could in the Synthoceps build. But that's going to round out Heart of Inmost Light. I definitely think it's still viable. It's performed well in Master Law Sector, where you're 20 power under. I definitely feel like it can still perform well in Grand Masters and even raid scenarios. It's definitely one that you can just put on and you don't have to think as much about it. And like I said, you can swap between Fleshit Storm, or you can go with Into the Fray. You have some different choices there. You have Shackle Grenades, you can still do Grapple Grenade. Everything's going to kind of work still just the same. It's just that you're not going for just the high damage. You're having more total survivability and flexibility. And being able to be more adaptable can sometimes be better than just focusing all in for one thing. Exotic number 3, Stronghold. Stronghold provides bonuses to guarding with swords. Now, a strength of Stronghold is its unlimited blocking with swords. That's going to allow for you to survive incredibly dangerous situations with or without Banner of War active. Each blocked hit is going to grant 2 stacks of Perfect Guard. You have a maximum amount of stacks of Perfect Guard being 100. Sword energy does not decay when you're guarding, so you can easily get to these 100 maximum stacks. Then, dealing damage with Perfect Guard stacks can grant restoration times 2, and when you're at 100 stacks and deal damage, it's going to be up to 16 seconds of restoration times 2. So this is going to provide the most survivability out of any of these builds. But the weakness, though, same thing on the other hand of being able to survive so much, is being unable to see your melee charges while you have the sword in hand. But on the other hand, it is the best healing combination, 65 HP per second. So it's important to know, it all revolves around blocking or holding your sword, guarding with that sword. So one of the strengths of a sword is going to be Lament. It's going to have extra healing that goes along with the restoration and some extra burst damage as well. And you're relying on weapon burst. You're not really relying on abilities to burst down enemies. You have the sword for the restoration, but you also have the sword for the weapon bursting down on champions and high health targets rather than just your melee abilities. But one thing that you have to consider is that it is a playstyle. It's a much different playstyle than what you might be used to. It's a combination of Stronghold and Banner of War, and it's a balance between blocking and aggressing. Because of this, it also doesn't synergize perfectly with Fleshit Storm. I mean, it's possible to do it, but it's more about optimizing blocking and restoration bonuses of Stronghold. Because why have Stronghold if you're not going to get the newly reworked restoration benefits from it? One thing you have to think about, though, is aerial enemies. You're limited on range, and you do have to close the distance when you have the sword. Now, because you can block, that does make it possible to be able to do that. But longer, more open engagements, especially when it's very enemy heavy, you're going to be using a sword to clear ads sometimes. And that's not always going to be the most effective thing, but that's what's going to help keep you get Banner of War stacks active. So this is a balancing act between timing, blocking, stacking Banner of War, stacking Perfect Guard to get some restoration on. It's a long time investment to reach 100 stacks of Perfect Guard. So time spent guarding is time that you're not dealing damage. There's a lot to balance with this playstyle and a lot of thinking involved. So I think the skill cap to it is kind of high. The Banner of War versus restoration. You got to balance this. And if you're too invested in blocking, then Banner of War could fall off. Also to note, the weakest buff is to sword damage. It's only 10% bonus compared to something like your melee or your glaive damage bonus when you're running Banner of War. Part 3, Banner of War builds. Let's take a look at what we can combine to make Heart of Inmost Light shine. So the focus of this build is high ability uptime because we're taking advantage of Heart of Inmost Light. What we're doing is we're running melee kickstart on top of Heart of Inmost Light's insane ability regeneration. By being able to loop our Fleshit Storm ability, it provides a lot of unraveling projectiles which is going to turn enemies into tangles. Those tangles are going to propagate our ability energy through the refreshing pickups artifact mods. So on top of being able to get some ability energy back by picking those up, we're also going to be able to deal some additional damage to champions anytime that they are stunned with the Fleshit Storm as well. So we're going to have a lot of unraveling going out. We're going to be making a lot of orbs. We're going to have high ability uptime. One way that we're going to accomplish having a melee ability up at almost 90% efficiency is going to be using Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo is going to be the cherry on top, the icing on the cake for this build, because it's going to ensure that our melee is up all the time. That's going to ensure that we're able to keep Banner of War active all the time as well, buffing our melee ability damage. Build number 2 is Synthoceps. We're all in with a focus on providing the highest multiplier for our melee damage. Now when it comes to the Synthoceps build, we're going to switch 1 or 2 mods here or there, but a lot of what you're seeing is going to be very similar. Now the fragments and aspects are going to be 100% identical, so no worries about that there. Now you can always switch from a rally barricade to a towering barricade if it is your personal preference to instead use the towering barricade, despite the cooldown increase that has occurred this season. But the minor change that we're going to see is going to be for our head. We're going to see 1 copy of hands-on be used instead of a copy of a heavy ammo finder. The reason I prefer when we're running Synthoceps to run a copy of hands-on is because Synthoceps buffs not only our melee damage of our default melee, our Frenzied Blade, or our Fleshit Storm, it's also going to buff our super damage. So it's important to take advantage of that buff to the super damage of 50%, which stacks multiplicatively with Banner of War by being able to get that super more often. And all of the melee kills that we're going to do are going to feed into our super energy with hands-on. So let's take advantage of that multiplicative super damage increase by running this copy of hands-on. Then on the class item, the other change that we have is instead of a copy of Bomber, we're going to switch that for Powerful Attraction. So when we do cast our barricade, we're going to be able to collect any orbs that are near us. Now everything else is going to be pretty much identical. We're still going to run Monte Carlo with this build because this build doesn't have a way to regenerate melee ability energy without using something like Monte Carlo. Now you can still run a tractor cannon 1-2 punch setup, but if you're looking at endgame content, which is what we make our builds for, you're going to want to go with Monte Carlo in this scenario. Our third and final build is for Stronghold. We're going to lean a little bit more into suspension with Stronghold because we're using a sword. We have to chase down enemies. We don't have the ability to always sit at range to be able to take the full advantage of strongholds. What we really need to do is make sure that we can immobilize our enemies, and we're going to do that by suspending them. So instead of Fleshit Storm, we're going to be going with Drenger's Lash. We're activating our class ability will create that ripple in reality that's going to travel forward and suspend targets. That's going to be one form of suspension. The other form of suspension is going to be the Shackle Grenade. So because we're running Drengers and Shackle, what we're going to be doing here is running Threat of Mind, where defeating suspended targets is going to grant class ability energy. That's going to feed a loop for Drenger's Lash. We also have Threat of Warding, which is pretty much basic in almost all of our Strand builds to be able to get access to the best damage resistance in the game, which is very easy for just picking up an Orb of Power. Threat of Continuity is going to make that Drenger's Lash, as well as that Shackle Grenade, have an extra duration to it. With the combination of Shackle Grenade and Threat of Continuity and Threat of Generation, we're going to have a loop that perpetuates itself there. So then let's take a look over at the armor mods and how we can support ourselves with Threat of Mind with building for Lament in mind. So because we're relying on one weapon to do a lot of what this build is about, we need to make sure that we have ammo for that weapon. So we're going to make sure that we run 1 copy of Heavy Ammo Finder to make sure that we always have ammo for Lament. Then that one weapon is kind of our workhorse, so we're also going to build into the Siphon mod that matches that weapon's element. So we're going to run Solar Siphon. Now on our arms, we're not using any kickstart because a lot of the time we're holding the sword in hand. Because we're holding that sword in hand, let's go with Bolstering Detonation because we know we're going to throw a Shackle Grenade. We know we're going to throw a Shackle Grenade to suspend enemies. Then we're going to get some more class ability when we cause damage with a melee attack. With the Frenzied Blade melee, we can still unravel a target because it severs them and they'll unwind into a tangle. And because we have refreshing pickups, we're still going to get some extra ability energy there. So we want to make sure that we have Focusing Strike on our arms as well. Then we also have 1 copy of Impact Induction, cause damage with that Frenzied Blade. It's going to reduce our grenade cooldown. it's going to see a very significant reduction in our grenade and class ability cooldown with this mod combination. On our chest, we're just going to run traditional resistance mods for elements, and then we're going to have to run 1 copy of melee damage resist because it's really important when we're getting so close to an enemy and using a sword. That's going to provide us some more survivability on top of the restoration that Stronghold is able to provide, and Lament's extra healing as well. Then we go all in with triple solar surges here to really get the most out of Lament, because swords get the weakest amount of damage increase from Banner of War. It's very important to take its damage up a little bit higher by using these triple solar weapon surges. Then we're going to make sure that we don't lose the benefit of those triple surges by running time dilation, so we have a longer decaying armor charge. 1 copy of Reaper to generate orbs more often, so we can have that triple solar surge available. And then 1 copy of Bomber. So we're really going to be able to immobilize a lot of enemies, because we're going to have, and you're going to find if you run this mod setup, that you're going to have a lot of suspension time, which is really good because one of the weak points in this build is chasing down enemies that run away. Being able to immobilize them and close the distance with your Lament is going to help out tremendously. So that's going to be the wrap up for the Lament Stronghold Banner of War. Now I want to leave you guys with my closing thoughts. At one point I thought that Strand Hunter was the king of suspension, and then for a moment I thought that Strand Warlock was going to be the king of suspension. I mean, originally, once I started running Abandoned Leaps, I thought, wow, this is the king of suspension. Shackle Grenade, Rally Barricade, casting Abandoned Leap everywhere, suspending targets over and over, getting Woven Mail. And then that all kind of got toned down. And then we got Banner of War, an aspect that's so good, not an exotic, not a weapon, an aspect that's so good that it's getting disabled for a day 1 contest raid. Let that sink in for a moment. But at this point, I've covered 3 of the hottest exotic builds for Banner of War: Stronghold, Heart of Inmost Light, and Synthoceps. This has been a long process. It's taken me over a week to really polish and put everything together. I hope you guys do enjoy this. I appreciate everyone for the continued support. Peace.